Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Waveney Rickers. I work at the School of Population Health at Curtin University in Perth, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Professor David Lawrence and Monica Majoszka. Today we're going to present the findings of the After the Fires study. We'll also be recording the presentation for anyone who would like to watch it offline, anyone who was unable to attend today. So please pass that information on to your colleagues. Before we go any further today, we'd like to acknowledge the sad passing of the volunteer fighter in New South Wales last week, and we'd like to extend our sympathies to his family, his friends, and his volunteer firefighter colleagues. I'd like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional owners of the land where we three are meeting today, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. So I'll just present a brief outline of what we'll cover today. I will discuss the background to the After the Fires study, a little bit about the 2019-20 Black Summer bushfires, a bit about the fire and rescue sector and who was involved in fighting the Black Summer bushfires. Monica will then cover people's experiences in fighting the fires, the mental health impacts they have experienced since then, and their help-seeking experiences. Lastly, David will cover the barriers to seeking help and the implications and recommendations arising from the study findings. At the end, there'll be some time for questions, and we'll ask you to just click on the raise your hand icon at the bottom of your screen and we will unmute you.
Otherwise, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the online chat.
So why was After the Fires conducted? The bushfires of the 2019-20 Australian Black Summer fire season saw widespread destruction caused by fires of unprecedented magnitude, duration and intensity. Through the Medical Research Future Fund, the Australian government provided funding to investigate both the physical and the mental health impacts caused by the fires, and After the Fires was part of the second stream of research. What did we do? Well, we set out to investigate the short and the long-term impacts of the Black Summer fires on both the employed and on the volunteer emergency personnel who responded to the fires. The study aimed to measure the mental health impacts, factors affecting mental health, the need for mental health supports, and people's use of support services. In this way, we sought to determine the best strategies to protect first responder mental wellbeing during and after future large-scale natural disasters. The scope of the study included fire and rescue, country fire authorities and state emergency services. It did not include other emergency services who may have responded to the fires, such as police, paramedics or wildlife rescue. So to ensure we measured long-term effects, we conducted two waves of research, 1 year and then 2 years after the fires. In wave 1 year after the fires, we surveyed over 4,000 volunteers and employees in 19 fire and rescue, rural fire and state emergency service agencies across Australia. A year later, in wave 2, we went back to 1,000 of them to find out how they'd been going in the intervening 12 months. Apart from 2 online surveys, we also conducted qualitative research, which was led by Professor Sharon Lorne from Flinders University. Professor Lorne conducted a series of focus groups and individual interviews 1 and 2 years after the fires in communities most affected by the fires to hear first-hand accounts and to gain a deeper understanding of how fighting the fires impacted people at a personal and community level. Today we'll focus on the survey data, but the focus groups provide some good context for those figures. So generally speaking, who are our fireys and state emergency services personnel? In Australia, we estimated that there are around 221,800 volunteers and an estimated 22,240 employees across the fire and rescue, rural fire and SES sectors. This data demonstrates how reliant we are on our volunteer workforce. Not surprisingly, only 18% of volunteers and employees in the sector are female. In contrast to the Australian population, volunteers have a much older age distribution, with 25% of the volunteers in the sector aged 65 years or over. This has implications for the sustainability of the volunteer sector into the future. We found that people stay in volunteer roles for a very long time, both within the volunteer and paid sectors. Many people commit to extended careers in the service, with the majority having over 11 years of service. So who took part in the Black Summer bushfire response? We estimated that 82,480 personnel were involved in responding to the Black Summer fires, including 64,500 volunteers and just under 18,000 employees. That means that volunteers represented 78% of the personnel responding to Australia's fire events. We know that around 80% of paid staff were involved, and it's unlikely that a high proportion could have been deployed to the fire response, as some paid staff were not located close to the fires. Plus, fire agencies also had to retain some staff outside of the bushfire response to maintain the capacity to respond to other emergencies. We calculated that in economic terms, the monetary value of volunteer labour contributed to responding to the Black Summer bushfires was significant. So, calculated at the rate of a junior firefighter, the total value of volunteer labour was an estimated $637.2 million. So an estimated 64,500 volunteers contributed approximately 1,840,000 person days at an estimated value of $577 million worth of labour to the bushfire response. And we know they each spent an average of around 3 weeks responding to the fires. When we look at the type of roles played by personnel who are actively involved in the fire response, the patterns of involvement were similar between volunteers and employees. Not surprisingly, volunteers had a much higher involvement in community support, whereas paid firefighters played a greater role in operations management. The fires lasted a long time, which meant a huge time commitment for those involved. And if they were volunteers, it didn't matter whether they had a paid job or not. Everything had to be committed to the fire effort. The fire front was so enormous that it required the whole of Australia to respond, with many firefighters travelling away from home to help in fighting the fires. As you can see, it was extremely common for volunteers to spend time away from home, with some people spending more than a fortnight away from their homes when needed. Similarly, around 3/4 of the paid firefighters spent time away from home too. Many of them travelled interstate or from the city to the country to fight the fires, and we know some even spent more than a month away from home. As I said earlier, the bushfires during that Black Summer fire lasted far longer than anyone could have anticipated. Consequently, the economic cost to the volunteers themselves was considerable, but it was almost inevitable in the circumstances. Access to paid or unpaid leave to participate in volunteering is not universally available. As shown on this slide, 22% of volunteers were not provided with time off from their paid employment while responding. Out of all volunteers, only a third were provided with paid leave. We need to do better by ensuring that our volunteer workforce is looked after emotionally, physically, and financially.
So rather surprisingly, people's commitment to volunteering was strengthened for a substantial portion of volunteers after the fires. So it was heartening to see this pattern was evident, especially amongst our younger volunteer workforce, with 60% of volunteers under 25 years old and 40% of volunteers aged 25 to 34 being more committed to their volunteering roles post the bushfires. So we discovered that many people were simply not adequately prepared for the scale and intensity of the Black Summer bushfires. and this had a flow-on effect on their mental health, unfortunately. Although all volunteers receive regular training, nothing could prepare a person for a fire event of that magnitude. So personnel were asked how well they were prepared for the 2019-20 bushfire season, physically, psychologically, and technically. So this table goes to show the majority of both volunteers and employees did have high levels of preparedness across all three domains, which is really a great figure. However, nevertheless, there were still an estimated 7,300 volunteers and 3,500 employees who reported that they were asked to take on roles for which they were not sufficiently trained. Many of them experienced a lot of stress as a result and were also far more likely to experience mental health conditions such as post-traumatic stress disorder or psychological distress. As we all know, COVID-19 was first detected in Australia in January 2020 and lockdown started in March 2020, very soon after the end of the Black Summer fires. When asked about the impact of the pandemic on their mental health and income, 36% of volunteers and 40% of employees indicated a small negative impact. We know from the focus groups that the lockdowns may have impacted their ability for volunteers to maintain connections with their employees, and particularly for those who may have not been able to attend regular training sessions in the aftermath of the fires. Those experiencing a loss of connection may have been in the smaller groups who reported a large negative impact. When we normally experience an emergency, the key people who respond are strangers to us. However, in country towns, people would usually know those who come to them in times of need. For many volunteers, they continued to see members of the community after responding to the Black Summer fires. Unfortunately, 11,000 volunteers reported receiving criticism from other members of their community. Some volunteers also reported feelings of guilt at not saving homes in their towns. To determine the impacts felt by volunteers and employees, after the fires measured several aspects of mental health and well-being, including probable PTSD, psychological distress, mental well-being, and suicidal thoughts and behaviours. We specifically developed and tailored questions to the emergency services sector to include the assessment of PTSD related to cumulative trauma exposure. So the study found that over 5,000 personnel responding to the fires have probable PTSD, very high psychological distress, or suicidal ideation, indicating high needs for mental health support. Rates of PTSD among volunteers and employees is slightly elevated compared to the general population, which sits around 4%. But rates for psychological distress are higher. More importantly, the rates for suicidal ideation are nearly twice that of the general population. Nearly a third of volunteers and a quarter of employees reported that they had felt that their life was threatened during the fires. Similar to this, around a fifth of volunteers and employees reported that they experienced a traumatic event that affected them deeply, that included things like coming across burnt wildlife or significant property loss. So you can see from this slide here that for those who had experienced a life-threatening situation or traumatic event, the rates of probable PTSD were 4 or more times higher. These people also reported lower rates of well-being and higher rates of suicidal thoughts and behaviours. Being involved in the Black Summer fires resulted in twice the number of people with mental health issues than would have been expected in the absence of events of this nature. That was true for both volunteers and employees. So, as Waveney said earlier, we surveyed people 1 and then 2 years after the fires. We found that there were lingering mental health impacts for many people. We were also able to identify some of the risk and protective factors associated with mental health changes in that period. We asked individuals that had probable PTSD, psychological distress, or suicidal ideation at wave 1 whether their mental health had changed by wave 2. We found that while nearly 3/4 of people's mental health remained good, there were many people and more people whose mental health had worsened or remained poor than had improved. And particularly among those who were experiencing psychological distress after the fires, the rates for those who had worsened from wave 1 to wave 2 were even higher. While distress can be due to many facets of life, and not just to the experiences while working and volunteering, the large-scale impacts of the Black Summer fires, the challenges associated with rebuilding communities, and their accompanying financial hardships would have all been contributing factors. In both waves, we asked people if they had seriously thought about ending their own life in the previous year. In the Wave 1 survey, 4.6% of volunteers and 4.9% of employees reported that they had seriously thought about ending their own life in the previous 12 months. These rates are around double the rates in the general population, so I'll just let that figure sink in. These figures increased slightly in the second year after the fires, as we could see here on the slides. While confronting, these figures are also important, especially seeing that suicidal ideation increased with the passage of time. This indicates that people have not been accessing the help that they need. We also looked at the risk factors associated with mental health changes between the two waves. So for those whose mental health had improved between wave 1 and wave 2, we found that they were more likely to exercise regularly, work in an inclusive workplace with a team that is supportive of their mental health challenges, and to have someone to open up to. So those are all very important contributing factors to having improved mental health. As for personnel whose mental health worsened or remained poor between the two waves, they showed evidence of poor coping strategies, such as use of alcohol to manage their feelings. They were also likely to have high levels of anger management issues as well as to have low levels of social support and to be very lonely. This goes to show just how important it is to have a sense of community and a supportive social system. Another contributing factor that is particularly relevant to this population is that of cumulative exposure to trauma. So after the fires confirmed previous evidence that cumulative exposure to traumatic events over the course of a career, whether it be voluntary or paid, is the main pathway to developing mental health problems, more so than the impact of any single traumatic experience. This means that an increase in large-scale natural disasters such as fires or floods will pose a problem in maintaining a sustainable volunteer workforce into the future. More people will be needed and for longer, meaning that continuous exposure to traumatic events will also increase. After the fires used a model of perceived needs for help with mental health or emotional well-being that splits people with a need for help into two categories, those who received help and those who did not. So this slide here is a little bit tricky, but I'll walk you through it. So the top half are those that did not receive help, and the bottom half are those that did receive help. So for those who did not receive help, we're further subdivided into those who did not believe that they had a problem, despite reporting symptoms of mental health issues and associated impairment, as well as those who are recognized that they had a problem, but they did not think that they needed any help, and those who recognized a need for help, but did not receive or seek help. Those who did receive help were asked if they received sufficient amount of help or needed more help for their mental health concerns. Overall, only 16% of volunteers and 22% of employees with high needs reporting received sufficient amount of help. so only 16% and 22%, suggesting that among those who do seek help, there's still issues to resolve regarding access to appropriate and sufficient levels of support. I will now take you on to David, who will be discussing barriers to help seeking and help seeking 2 years post fires.
Thanks, Monica, and thanks, Waveney. So now I'm going to look at some of the barriers to help seeking that we found in the study. So seeking help for mental health issues was clearly a complicated and complex issue for many volunteers. When the focus groups took place, it was noticeable that the participants in Wave 2 still recounted vividly the events of the Black Summer fires, down to the details of days, dates, hours, specific interactions they'd had, decisions taken, and so forth. Several participants told us that they had sought psychological counselling or other formal mental health support, but they were aware of other volunteers who were still struggling with mental health issues, who had not sought support or who had refused to do so. Mental health impacts were seen as a process that lingered over time, not something just arising from a distinct event and then resolving. Anyone who perceived a need for help with mental health issues, who either did not seek help or delayed seeking help for at least 3 months, we asked them about the barriers that they perceived in seeking help at both Waves 1 and Wave 2. The most common barrier to help seeking among employees was wanting to deal with the problems informally, either by themselves or with family and friends, suggesting that personnel in the sector with emerging mental health needs may be waiting rather than seeking formal help when problems first arise. As we can see here, there are a range of commonly reported barriers amongst the emergency services community, such as the fear of being treated differently by others, that their career prospects may be harmed, and that they would be seen as weak. There is a long underlying stigma in the sector that still needs to be addressed. When we looked at volunteers, the barriers were fairly similar, with many volunteers also preferring to deal with problems informally. Similarly, volunteers were worried about being treated differently, being seen as weak, as well as feeling that they would be a burden to their team or their family if they were to open up about their mental health concerns and seek help. During the focus groups, volunteers also raised a number of concerns about seeing counsellors who had no familiarity with volunteer firefighting and what it entails. They also talked about the fear of stigma or being misunderstood and feeling vulnerable in unfamiliar settings, along with organisational red tape that undermined their attempts to connect with support services. We know that for many people, the typical experience of mental health issues is one of gradual onset and development of severity over a long period of time, perhaps months or even years. And there is a strong tendency in many people at first to wait to see how the problem is going to develop, to see if it will go away before seeking help. On a positive note, we found that most people felt that their mental health was supported by their agencies. This was definitely encouraging news. However, the sentiments expressed by some focus group participants 2 years after the fires indicate there is still some way to go in terms of organisational culture. For example, people reported the lack of transparency and accuracy in how their organisations undertook post-fire assessments of the events and some of the logistical decisions that were taken during the fires. They described these processes as damaging and re-triggering and perceived their purpose as finding someone to blame rather than constructively learning from the events and improving future responses. Emergency services have a culture of being strong and stoic and never admitting to weakness. We need to change this way of thinking to ensure that emergency services workers don't equate mental health problems with weakness, and that they understand the need to talk about how they feel and realize they are probably not the only ones feeling that way. So now that we've shared some of the findings, I'll talk a little bit about what they imply, and I'll finish with some recommendations that we've formulated based on the study as a whole. While the Black Summer response was an exceptional commitment for emergency services, the increasing number of natural disasters that we've faced in recent years makes it important to learn from these experiences to improve Australia's preparedness to respond to future disasters. With a warming and drying climate, it's likely we're going to experience more severe fire, flood, and other events. So what did we learn from after the fires? First, we think it's important that we recognise the need to keep our volunteer workforce sustainable. Clearly, we have a very strong reliance on volunteers in responding to these types of emergencies. A positive finding from the study was that commitment to volunteering in these roles remains strong. However, it is equally apparent that volunteering can come at a cost, and not just an economic one. In the light of the warming and drying climate, we're going to be relying on our volunteer firefighters more and more. It is going to be even more difficult to expand the volunteer pool when the impact of cumulative trauma from more frequent disasters may also impact on the numbers who remain mentally able to cope. We need to protect those who protect us. More needs to be done to increase levels of help seeking as soon as symptoms occur. Managers and supervisors need to improve their mental health literacy to be able to understand what are the signs and indicators of emerging mental health issues. We need to continue working on reforming our organizational culture to be open to talking about the emotional impacts of the work that we do. There is opportunity for better training and greater levels of preparedness in preparing for large-scale events. We saw a number of people are reporting that they had been asked to take on roles for which they were not appropriately trained and incurred extra stress and impacts associated with that. And we need greater numbers and increased accessibility of mental health supports and services, particularly in regional areas, ability to scale up our ability to provide mental health supports when there are significant disasters or significant events in particular geographic locations. Secondly, we need to continue to reduce stigma and encourage openness to discuss emotional issues. After the fires found that paid personnel in particular are concerned about adverse career impacts and being taken away from operational work if they raise mental health concerns. Most volunteer and paid firefighters do the work they do because they want to serve their communities. But emergency services continue to have a culture of people believing that they need to be strong and impervious to the situations they experience in order to support their communities in times of need. And as a result, that mental health issues undermine this appearance of strength. But it is natural for people within their own communities responding to community threats to be affected when they witness disasters befalling the communities they live and work in. Changing this long-standing culture of mental health stigma will be a slow process. However, this is a vitally important step. Ignoring emerging mental health issues, waiting to see if they go away or if they can be handled informally, can lead to worsening symptoms, greater levels of impairment, longer recovery times once treatment is received, and reduced likelihood of complete recovery when people finally do seek help. Thirdly, we need to create opportunities for time out despite the logistical challenges. The duration and intensity of the Black Summer fires saw many volunteers undertaking challenging levels of work for long periods of time, with many working 14-hour shifts and spending many nights away from home. This can expose people to risk of burnout if they don't have time to process the experience of one event before moving on to the next. Previous research has stressed the importance of taking a break after attending a particularly traumatic or intense event before going on to the next job. In large-scale disasters, it is not always possible to take time out, and first responders will always keep working as long as they are needed and are able to. But it's important that agencies continue to look for solutions for this issue to ensure that we have capacity to provide people with adequate rest opportunities when undertaking this type of work. Lastly, we need to scale up the capacity to provide adequate and timely support services following major disasters. In many areas, available mental health supports are at or above capacity day to day in ordinary times, and have limited any capacity at all to provide additional support when needed. Government agencies need to consider how to build capacity to scale up the level of support available following major disasters. To date, organisations with a predominantly paid workforce have been better equipped and have more programs and resources to support employee wellbeing than has typically been the case in the volunteer sector, particularly in light of the high reliance on volunteers in responding to the 2019-20 bushfires. It may be appropriate to consider how supports that are provided to paid firefighters can be extended so that they are accessible to volunteers. And after the fires, we clearly saw that the work that volunteers were doing was equally challenging, equally intense, and exactly the same nature as what paid firefighters were doing. Based on these implications, we have formulated 3 main recommendations aimed mainly at emergency services agencies, but perhaps a wider government response might also be needed. There are several areas where emergency services agencies should put their focus, including mental health training is critical in helping people to understand symptoms, what self-care strategies might help, and when to seek formal help. Secondly, providing a strong peer support program, as we know these can be particularly helpful when other help is not available. Third, getting people used to regular check-ins to encourage openness to discuss emotional concerns and to reduce the stigma associated with mental health and emotional issues. Fourth, providing access to mental health professionals with the experience and ability to understand what emergency services work and life in emergency services is like, and what it means to be a firefighter. Fifth, making sure family members are included in both training and educational workshops to ensure family members have the ability and knowledge to support their loved ones and themselves. Emergency services agencies should continue building a workplace culture that recognises the importance of self-care and taking breaks as a key aspect of operational performance, including strategically planned scheduled breaks in a designated rest zone and a rotation system to ensure individual firefighters are not physically or mentally overloaded. Scaling up mental health support services will be challenging, since there is limited capacity in the regions already. Some possible ways forward include establishing partnerships with other community organisations to expand the range of services available during large-scale disasters, providing strong volunteer peer support programs, continuing to conduct regular check-ins with volunteer firefighters for at least 2 years following a major disaster, and ensuring this is done by people who understand the culture of firefighting. To this end, it is crucial that planning and provision of mental health resources proceeds more quickly and with the commitment that accompanies the delivery of more visible assets, such as fire trucks and personal protective equipment. Lastly, we have come to the recommendations arising out of the focus groups with volunteers. They want to be recognised for their local expertise in terms of understanding the best ways to tackle fires in their own environment. They want to be recognised as a crucial resource for the fire effort. They want to be acknowledged for the mental health toll that comes with volunteering over an extended period of time. And they want to be provided with ongoing mental health support well after the event is over, as we know that mental health impacts linger over time and can get worse without treatment. They also want to be adequately prepared for large-scale events. So just to sum up what we've discussed here today that we found in the After the Fire study. There were over 5,000 employees and volunteers who have high needs for mental health support based on having probable PTSD, very high psychological distress, suicidal behaviours. And that's more than double the number that we would have expected if the bushfires had not occurred. Only around 1,000 of these have received a sufficient level of health or support for their mental health, which is an important finding. Another important issue raised by this research is the need for support services to have the capacity to scale up following major natural disasters, such as the Black Summer fires. Earth has just experienced its hottest year on record, and make no mistake, we are at real risk of another Black Summer. Already seen the prognosis for this summer, is particularly bad. There have already been a number of fires and a number of deaths of people responding to them. It's important to remember that improving Australia's preparedness for future fire seasons is not just about ensuring that we have the right equipment, but making sure that we can support the people whose role it is to fight the fires and to support their communities. Tragedy and loss have immediate and enduring consequences. While lost property and stock can be replaced, the internal scars people suffer are less readily seen, but they can take longer to heal and they may resurface if nothing is done about them now. Our largely volunteer workforce is the most valuable resource we have for disaster response. Let's learn from our experiences and let's make sure we can continue to have a strong and resilient volunteer workforce that is recognised, valued, and supported by the communities that they serve. Before we wrap up, I would like to thank everyone who has attended today, and I'd particularly like to pay tribute to those firefighters and volunteers who work so hard to keep our community safe during the Black Summer. I'd also like to acknowledge the emergency services agencies who continue to create a mentally healthy workplace and environment for their personnel, and to recognise the significant work that has been ongoing in recent years to improve mental health supports and address cultural and stigma issues within the sector. If anyone needs access to support today or feels distressed from the content that we've been presenting, or knows of someone who needs confidential 24/7 support, please feel free to scan the QR code of the Black Dog Institute listed on this screen. And we've also provided the website for people who might want to access the National Emergency Worker Support Service. For more information about the study, please feel free to visit our website. We've recently published the results of the After the Fire study, and a summary of the findings as well as the full report is available for download. And also feel free to contact us through the After the Fire's email address or to contact us directly. So I'd like to thank everyone for listening to us